Good evening and welcome to tonight's hangout on the Gospel According to John. We're following through the book Meditations on According to John by Dr. Herold Weiss. Tonight's topic is Salvation is from the Jews. It's a very interesting topic. Let's invite the Lord to be with us. Lord, I pray that you will be with us through your Spirit. The Spirit of truth will guide us into all the truth that we need in the name of Jesus. Amen. I'm sorry I started just a couple minutes late, and I'm also going to apologize for some people who may not find this live and may, and hopefully we'll find it later, that I set up this Hangout event on the wrong page, since I manage one for my company Energeon Publications and one for myself. And in order to have these on the right YouTube channel and the right Google Plus page, they need to be set up in the right location. And so I had to correct that at the last minute, and hopefully those who want to find it will be able to do so as we move forward. It's interesting that tonight's salvation is from the Jews, and I'm just looking here at my Facebook on my phone because I just got a notice about a post from one of our Energeon authors. Now, this isn't the Energeon company page. This is my private page, but it is very relevant, and I'm going to refer to it later tonight. Nancy got her copies of her new book, Why Christians Should Care About Their Jewish Roots. I think you can probably see the connection between her book and what we're talking about now. And she got her shipment, and we see her with pictures of them. I'm going to kind of hold that up. I don't know if you can manage to see it at all, but yeah, nope, that lighting isn't so good. But that is a picture of the new book, Why Christians Should Care About Their Jewish Roots, and with the author. That's available. You can check with direct.energeon.com, or if you're around Nancy's area up in Alabama, she is selling a number of them herself. So that's our rather relevant, shall we say, publishing event of the day. And I'm going to refer to Nancy's book a little bit later in this discussion. So, getting back, the topic, salvation is from the Jews, and this is from chapter 15 of Dr. Weiss's book. Now, I'm going to be, again, I use an ebook edition of this book while I'm in order to in our discussion, and so I'm going to be looking at that here on my tablet as we go through, and I want to review just a little bit what's in the chapter. Now, I don't always go over the material in the chapter itself that much, because that's why you get Dr. Weiss's book. And as a matter of fact, I will, I think, say that I find his ability to cover the material is really quite exceptional. That's why I published the book, and that's why I chose to spend all of this time teaching from it. As things stand, I'm having a little bit of difficulty with, let's see if I can, I'm having a memory issue on my tablet. How's that for having multiple errors in a day? And what I'm going to do is get rid of one of these so that I can see what I need to see today. There we go. We should be able to take a look. Just a moment here. Let's find the problem, of course, with the ebook, as you're finding right now, is that if you have a bit of a problem with your equipment, you can get stuck right there, and I am having that problem right now with looking at the book that I want to look at. And so we're going to continue without actually referencing the book, and so that we can keep this moving. I apologize for that delay. This chapter that in Dr. Weiss's book is based first and foremost on the conversation that Jesus has with the woman of Samaria, and on the statement that he makes to her, and this is John chapter 4. Now you remember that the way he has written this book, he's taken certain phrases, certain statements of the book, and then viewed them from the overall position of the gospel. This is coming from John 4, verse 22, and that passage says, you all worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, because, and here's the phrase, salvation is from the Jews. Now that's a very interesting phrase, and you'll understand Jesus here is talking directly to a woman who is a Samaritan. So it's not only interesting, as I would put it, it's interesting in the other sense, which is this is a challenging statement to her, and possibly even an insulting statement. You worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. And it's interesting there that part of the lesson of this passage is that salvation comes to Samaritans through the medium of Jesus and through this meeting with the Samaritan woman. One of the things that Dr. Weiss has brought up in earlier chapters is that he makes the assumption that the community that surrounded the Gospel of John, the community that this book served, probably did include Samaritans as well. But there's also this challenging idea of the use of the term the Jews. Now, we discussed that earlier in a couple of our studies, because the usage of the label the Jews in John has been the source of a great deal of difficulty. It's very easy to read John and get the idea that it is, in fact, certainly anti-Judaic and very possibly more generally anti-Semitic. And in fact, some of these statements about the Jews in the Gospel of John have been used by Christians in support of really vile acts against the Jewish people. And one of the responses that Dr. Weiss had in writing his own book is to put these uses of the Jews in quotes. And I pointed out earlier that it's very important for us as modern readers and as Christian readers to be careful how we use what is very much an internal debate. That is to say, the community that is initially addressed by the Gospel of John. And understand that when I say the community that's initially addressed, I'm not saying the book does not address Christians at a later date. But it starts somewhere. As we read the scriptures, we both have, there's a message to us, but that message to us is put in side a message that is first presented to somebody else. We are, in a sense, spectators, but we are spectators who are then invited to become participants in the drama that is taking place. We start reading the story, we start hearing the story, we start viewing these things as they take place, and then we become part of those things. But as we become part of the story, we have to make sure that we understand what has been going on and how certain things happen. So throughout passages through John 6, 7, 8, in 9 and so forth, there are these very intense arguments with the Jews. And that's why Dr. Weiss puts that in quotation marks, because this is an argument between Jews and Jews. And there is quite a different sense of what the word has to mean in that sort of a context than there would be if I were to use the phrase in that same kind of sense. And that is, there is a distinction between those who are the believers, those who are accepting Jesus, those who are not, but also those who are actively opposed. Some people would propose using the term the Jewish leaders or the Judeans. But Judeans is a little bit broader, identifying those who were in effect the Roman collaborators, the government of Judea as a Roman province. And so we see this fairly nasty argument take place over the course of several chapters in John, and all of the things that these opponents are. Now, the thing that I would emphasize before I even go into talking about this in a little bit more detail is that as Christians, we need to be very careful how we apply such things, because first of all, what I say about somebody else, about somebody of another who is part of another group, is different from what two people within the group might find it acceptable to say to one another. And also, as an outsider, again, I don't understand the social dynamics. I'm not in the same fight. And so I need to watch that very carefully. I would say that no matter how we interpret the rest of the passage, we cannot interpret it we cannot interpret what these two groups that were fighting one another said about each other as a license for us to look down on people or despise people. This is a point that Dr. Weiss makes very clearly in the chapter. I want to look also to the conclusion of his chapter, and before we get there, I have to say it's a secondary element, but for many it might have even more force, that says we better watch out how we read these negative things, these negative sayings that are being that we have about certain Jews. And about even the Old Testament. You remember we talked about the law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I discussed the translation of that passage. And the way I've translated it there can be questioned, but I'm using that translation because that's the kind of contrast that people tend to read into it. But at the same time, as Dr. Weiss says again in this chapter, John is a gospel that is very dependent. He says probably the most dependent on the scriptures of the Hebrew scriptures, what we see as Christians as the Old Testament. And that dependence itself, if you look at the great respect at one time for these roots, then you have to question whether these other negative comments about certain people can be legitimately universalized? And I think the answer has to be very clearly no, that the Gospel of John, in treating Jewish people with respect, in treating Samaritans with respect, even in treating Gentiles with respect, goes counter to any sort of negative application of that. We talk about interpreting in context. Well, the context of the Gospel of John here very broadly says we're building on the story of the Old Testament. We're building on the story of the Hebrew Scriptures. We aren't discarding, we're building. We do think that we have found a new piece of the story, that we're moving forward into new and exciting ground, but this is not discarding. Now, the final point that I want to make from the chapter, and I apologize for not being able to give you the page numbers because of the problem there that I'm having with my e-reader here for the moment. But it's basically the last page and partial page of chapter 15 in the book, Meditations on According to John, is that because of the example of the Gospel of John, because of the example of Jesus' words and actions in John, that we need to find a way to get along with our brothers and sisters who share the same roots. And he there even refers as well to learning to get along with the adherents of Islam. So this is, it's a very interesting chapter, and it relates to a number of topics. Now, since I already talked a little bit about the Old Testament, the law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, I'm going to take a few lines away from that. In the first thing, in what Dr. Weiss is talking about in this chapter, is the focus on the dependence of the Gospel of John on the Old Testament. And I want to spend some time on that point because I think many Christians have a hard time seeing it in the Gospel of John. You go to the Gospel of Matthew and you repeatedly have, this happened so that it would be fulfilled what was said by the prophet. This happened so that it would be fulfilled what was said by the prophet, and so on and so forth. So you have numerous cases where the connection is made explicit. In John, you have less explicit connections, and you have a lot more connections by means of an allusion. Dr. Weiss points out how, for example, Jesus as the Good Shepherd looks back to the chapters in the 30s in Ezekiel, chapter 33, 34, where the prophet brings the message from the Lord against the shepherds of Israel who have failed, and says that he's going to get a good shepherd. There's an allusion here when Jesus comes in and says, I am the good shepherd. He doesn't say this was done to fulfill what was said by the prophet Ezekiel, but nonetheless, the connection is definitely made. But then there's also a connection besides the allusions in the general way in which the book is rooted in Jewish understanding, rooted in the understandings that we would find in the Hebrew Scriptures. One of our problems as Christians today is that, as I heard an author, Deanna Thompson, I believe was her name. She wrote a theological commentary on Deuteronomy for Westminster John Knox Press. I heard her speak. And as she called it, she said that we are, as Christians, practical Marcionites. Now, Marcion was early church heretic, I guess he was called, who basically he said that the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament were completely different. And so he began discarding texts on those points. For him, the Old Testament, therefore, was not of great value because it was about another God. It was not about the God of grace, the God of love of the New Testament. And so there were a lot of passages that he didn't like, a lot of books in the New Testament that Marcion didn't like. Now, the church declared him a heretic, and most modern Christians, if they even know who Marcion is, and I suspect it's a very small percentage who know who are aware of who he was, would condemn his viewpoint. They say, no, the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament. But the problem is that our actions don't suit those particular words. It is we resist reading the Old Testament passages. I think I've told before, even in this study, the story of starting to talk to a group, and I was going to teach a class kind of going through an overview of the Old Testament, and I asked how many of them had read the entire Old Testament, and a whole bunch of hands came up. And then somebody said, well, do we have to have read the begats? And I said, well, I was, trying to get an idea of how much you'd read. Well, several hands went down about the begats, and then do we have to have read all of that stuff, in Numbers and Leviticus and Numbers? And when I said, well, again, I'm trying to get an idea, more hands went down. That even the people who had read from the Old Testament had read very selectively and left out a lot of the boring bits. Now, I have found that as far as learning the Old Testament enough to refer to it and to know when an allusion is being made is even less frequent. And that's what Dr. Thompson, this is Deanna Thompson, I'm going to refer to another Thompson here a little bit later, was saying here is that in practical terms, we as Christians do not make the Old Testament, make the Hebrew Scriptures part of our the sources of our faith. We don't study them. We don't refer to them. We don't grant them authority in our lives. And so in practice, we are Marcionites. We do what Marcion did, only we don't do it openly like he did. We would all say that we respect it. If you ask most Christians, is the whole Bible inspired? Is the whole Bible authoritative? They'll say yes. But if you then say, how much time have you spent on, let's say, Ezekiel, or even reading all of Jeremiah through, suddenly we have this very narrow focus. Now, that very narrow focus will tend to work well when you're reading the book of Matthew, where it gives you a reference. And if you have a Bible, say, with good marginal references, or as I have in my Greek New Testament, where it gives me a reference and says, where did this material come from? So we have, this was done to fulfill what was spoken by such and such a prophet. We go look it up, and we read this narrow passage. So, so we have this very carefully selected piece of the Old Testament, which is determined by mostly what is quoted, actually explicitly quoted in the New. And that's where, rather than seeing the whole pattern of the Old Testament. And so it's harder for us to recognize when we get to the Gospel of John that this is heavily rooted in what is said in the Old Testament. And we kind of divide this up into, into three kinds of connections. The most common one, and the one that I heard the most when I was growing up, is what I would call the prediction fulfillment. Essentially, a Christian knowledge of the Old Testament that's largely built on finding the predictions and seeing how they are fulfilled in the New Testament. So it's a pattern of connections. It's interesting in doing this that the number of predictions and fulfillments varies widely between authors. There's an author I know who finds more than 300 predictions and fulfillments, predictions made in the Old Testament that are fulfilled in the New. Many of those, I have to say, are of extremely questionable character. And but that's the prediction fulfillment. I'm going to return to that in just a couple of minutes. The second one is what I call contrast replacement. Contrast and replacement is at least related to this idea that we talked about of the Marcionite idea. And this simply says you read very directly something like the John 1, the law comes through Moses, grace and truth comes through Jesus Christ, so we're going to discard the law. Certain types of Christian dispensationalism follow this kind of a pattern, where you say the law was valid for a period of time, from, say, the time of Moses to the time of Christ. Different dispensational systems differ a bit. Some of the very detailed ones then say that there's a period of time during the ministry of Jesus that's kind of a transition, and then you go to the apostolic age, and after the apostolic age you go to the church age, and scriptures apply at different times. So for them, this material, the Mosaic law, no longer applies as such, and so it has essentially been replaced. Now, very often you'll find a similar idea that the Jews as a people were similarly replaced by the church. It's interesting that these two ideas, even though you're often going to hear them together, come kind of into a contrast, because by saying that the church replaces the Jewish people, these same advocates then apply the promises that are made to Israel out of the Old Testament to the church. There's a subcategory of that which takes those same promises that were made to Israel and will apply them to various nations. You will find people who will apply specific promises that were made to Israel under the blessing of God, for example, to the United States. I don't have time to go into the validity, except I will tell you that I absolutely reject that kind of reapplication of those promises. Now, sometimes you can find in promises that God made to Israel, you can find principles that apply to the way God works with everyone. Let's take 2 Chronicles. The chapter escapes me. It'll come back to me in just a moment. But in any case, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. It's a very common reference. Probably most of you know what I'm referring to, even though the number just went right out of my head. In any case, there is a promise that is definitely made to Israel. And well, you cannot, I don't believe that you can apply this directly to everybody else. It is a promise that can be taken by the church in principle, because that is the way that promise to Israel tells us how God works with people. God works with his church very much in the same way, and would say that if we humble ourselves and pray, then he will bless. And that comes directly into the third approach that I take, which is continuation or completion. Continuation or completion says that we are carrying on the same story. And so, well, the church connects to Israel. Blessings carry on through the church that were originally promised, and this goes back in a very strong way, a valid way, to the Old Testament, right back to the promise to Abraham, because Abraham is given the promise that in him all the nations will be blessed. And so when we see it that way in terms of continuation, then we are receiving the blessing that God provided through Abraham and eventually through Israel, going back to what Jesus says to the woman at the well in John 4:22. Salvation is from the Jews. The salvation started there. The salvation came through there and moved forward and has come forward to us, to others. And so those are three views that we have. Now, we tend, I think, to go a lot for the first one. And the reason is that as long as you find yourself able to accept the prediction and fulfillment that is involved in these prophecy lists, it sounds very solid. But there's a certain idea here about interpretation that I think it's very important for us to know. And I'm going to refer here, there's a whole chapter, and again, this book I don't have in front of me right now, but there's a chapter in the book, Who's Afraid of the Old Testament God, by Dr. Alden Thompson. Now we're talking about a different Dr. Thompson, but still somebody who's working with the Old Testament. Who's Afraid of the Old Testament God? There's a chapter that's called The Best Story in the Old Testament, the Messiah. And in there, Dr. Thompson comes to the point, he refers to reading about all of these promises and then starting to read them in the New Testament in context and feeling that he was standing on very shaky ground because many of them didn't seem to tie things down in the way that he thought they should. And I would commend to you Dr. Thompson's book, and I'm going to mention here that on the Energion Publications YouTube channel or on the Google Plus page, we're going to have a hangout on June the 2nd, which is this coming Tuesday, with Dr. Alden Thompson, Dr. Alan Bevere. They're going to talk about violence in the Bible, in particular looking at the Old Testament. And so that's going to address a very interesting issue, and both of these men are very well qualified to discuss that. I expect that to be a very interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. Alden Thompson, in looking at this, felt that he needed to divide these passages, these claims of the connection in the New Testament, into categories. There are those Old Testament prophecies that Jesus applied to himself. There are those that people saw as prophecies as the events took place. There are prophecies that were recognized as messianic, and some of the ones that were generally seen as messianic were fulfilled in the life of Jesus, and some were not. And there are also things that were later applied to Jesus by the church with study and reflection. Now, that's a very interesting set of divisions and gives us an opportunity then to evaluate these one at a time. As a matter of proof, however, many less sound like something that would be known ahead of time as a prediction and then recognized as a fulfillment. Alden Thompson lists a very few prophecies into that category. Now, I think that there's a bit of a problem with the methodology of saying that this is how we know who Jesus was. And one of the things, again, that Alden points out that's important for us to note, two things, he says. The first of the things that is important for us to note is that the Jews of Jesus' day didn't recognize what was going on, nor has Judaism today recognized the way we understand these prophecies. Now, there's certainly biblical material to discuss, the how and why of that, and that's I'm going to have to leave a lot of that out because I'm definitely going to run out of time before I'm finished today. But the second thing that he points out is that the disciples themselves didn't recognize. The disciples themselves did not seem to understand what was going on. There was this continuous case of here's what's going on, here's the scripture that's being fulfilled, here's what's going to happen, and the disciples saying, we don't get it, we don't get it, we don't get it. And our way of responding to this too many times is by saying that the disciples were a bunch of idiots. But the fact is, I don't think that we would be doing much better. One of the mistakes that we make, and I think this includes when we're talking about interpretation, when we're talking about translation, is that when we hear an interpretation or a translation that's contrary to our own view, our immediate idea is to stand against it and find all of the reasons to challenge it. But the first thing we need to do is try to understand why someone would understand a passage in that way, why someone would translate a particular passage in that way. And for Christians, probably a key to understanding this is realizing that we have taken the prophecies that Jews would regard as messianic prophecies, and we have split them into two parts. The first set of them being applied to the first coming of Jesus, but the second set being applied to a later second coming. At least many Christians have. You'll understand that this also depends a bit on what eschatological vision, what we think the end times are going to be like. But at a minimum, we have taken prophecies that were right alongside some of the ones that we believe were fulfilled by Jesus the first in his first coming, and we have applied those promises to the second coming. If a good place to check this out is to read, for example, Isaiah 64 through 66. Look at the various verses and think about how we as Christians would apply these to New Testament and to end time events. So the first thing that we need to do is try to ask the question, other than saying that people are simply, not able to understand or something of that nature, we need to ask the question, why would these passages be interpreted in that particular way? And so that's important on a prediction fulfillment. Let me give an example. If we go to Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15, we have Jesus has gone down into Egypt, and then he stays there for some time and returns. And Matthew tells us that, and remember I mentioned Matthew as the gospel that does this explicitly the most, whereas John tends to do it implicitly and by allusion. Matthew says, now this was written to fulfill what was written by the prophet, out of Egypt I have called my son. Well, if you'll pardon me for a second while I turn. I should have had this turned to, but sometimes it's hard to have all the passages done. I'm going to turn to Hosea 11:1, and we're going to spend just a minute looking at what Hosea says in that particular case, because we're just now being told to that this is written to fulfill what was spoken by Isaiah. It says, when Israel was a child or was a young man, I loved him, and from Egypt I called my son. Okay, that sounds good. Contextually, my first reaction would be to say that the son is Israel. Israel was a young man, and from Egypt and that's the Lord speaking, called my son. But I called them. The more I called them, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to idols. So is Hosea 11:2 also a prediction of the Messiah? Or what is going on here? It's a really interesting point and goes down to this classification of the prophecies, but I think it also tends to lead us a bit from this first option to what I call the last one, which is the continuation and the completion. And the continuation and the completion is something that fits very well with the way the Gospel according to John is written. I personally think it fits well with the Gospel of Matthew if we realize what we're reading, but it's a lot easier to point out if we're reading in John. And here's the thing. Jesus is seen as fulfilling what Israel did not. So Jesus is being pointed back. We're now drawing in the Exodus, that Old Testament story of salvation. You're going to have, you see these key points are going to be brought through, especially in the prophets as they talk about God's salvation. The call out of Egypt. The call out of Egypt is repeated over and over as the foundation. For example, as you get to Exodus 20, I am the Lord your God who's brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Here's what you're going to do. And so you go forward. That was then given its another completion, I guess you could say, not really a counterpoint, but just a reinforcement by the exile and the restoration, the exile into Babylon and the restoration. Again, we're talking about God's grace applied in this story. You have the story of judgment, you have the story of restoration, and then Israel comes back. These stories then form a foundation, and what Matthew has done here is brought the story of the Exodus into the story of Jesus. And so the issue here is less, here's why you can believe in Jesus, because look, he got called out of Egypt, just like Hosea said he would, but rather, here is Jesus bringing salvation to Israel by fulfilling that redemption. And when I say fulfilling, filling that redemption with new meaning, and continuing on that story of redemption by doing the job right. Remember earlier I referred to Ezekiel and the promise that God would bring good shepherds. He was going to replace the shepherds that were leading Israel away and bring a good shepherd. John, getting into John chapter 10, I am the good shepherd. Here we have this continuation and completion. Or we might say completion and continuation, however contradictory that may seem. But in a sense, it's bringing one aspect of the story to the close, the bad shepherds, and the good, and a new aspect is brought in, the good shepherd, who is then going to carry on feeding the sheep. Relate this to John chapter 21, where that's the role that is given to Peter. And so we see instead here of a prediction and fulfillment, we see a beginning, continuation, completion, and these are tied together. Now, how does that work? One of the things I've frequently wondered is, why would you need all of these predictions to believe in Jesus? Most of this is being done after the resurrection. They look at the resurrection, they say, Jesus rose from the dead. And with that as the foundation for what you're going on, and I'm not getting into all the debates about details on the resurrection, simply the early Christians believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and that was sufficient. The question for them was less, at that point, is this the Savior of the world? The question rather is, how does this tie? How does this tie together? How do we carry forward? What is the meaning of what has happened? And so you see these events being interpreted through sayings and stories from the Old Testament scriptures. So we're carrying on the story. Let me bring into that, and I mentioned earlier Nancy Petrie's book. That's just our just released Why Christians Should Care About Their Jewish Roots. Her chapter 4 goes into Romans 9 through 12. There's an interesting thing about Romans 9 through 12. in the Arminian circles, which I, as a Methodist, tend to spend most of my time in, Romans 9 through 12 is very rarely preached, one or two verses. But really going through Romans 9 through 12 is not all that common. When I took a class in Romans as an undergraduate, we got through chapter 8. I've heard a lot of sermons then on Romans 12, a few on 13, a few on 14, but that's about what happens to Romans. Romans 9 to 12, we don't hear so much. Now, some of my Reformed friends might be saying, yeah, well, we've got that one covered. We're always preaching from Romans 9 through 12. And there's a good reason you Arminians don't do it, because it has a lot of election in there and maybe some good predestination. But the problem there is that we're reading Romans 9 through 12 for another reason than the reason that Paul wrote it. Paul wrote it because he has just said in Romans 1 through 8, here is the wonderful salvation that has come through Jesus Christ. Jews and Gentiles were both, lost in their sin, but Jesus has come and given us a way. But then he's asking the question, the same question many of us need to ask probably more often than we do, is what about the Jews? And for Paul, this was an intensely personal thing. What about my people? That's why he says in these chapters that he would be glad if he could be accursed, if it would bring salvation to his people. So Romans 9 through 12 is precisely about how the church connects to Judaism, and to some extent, that's going to tell us how the New Testament connects to the Old. And you have here, not directly, but partly. And here we have the new being grafted into the root of the old. And I'm going to use this as a continuation argument that's saying, we're taking the blessing that God promised Abraham and continuing that blessing. It came through the Jews. Salvation is from the Jews through the root. But two things that Paul warns us of in Romans 9 through 12. One is, of course, it's not so much a warning as a promise, which says that the native branches can be grafted back. And the second is that if we aren't going to accept this salvation, accept this commission that God has given us, that if, Paul says, if God was willing to take out the native branches, how much more you who were grafted in. Romans 9 through 12 is all about the call to ministry, the call to be a blessing to the world. We are grafted in to be a blessing. We are grafted in to take the blessing that comes through Israel and take that blessing to the world. We tend to like to read texts about chosenness in the sense that we're chosen because we're special, or we're chosen in order to be in a better place. Chosenness is generally about, in the Bible, is generally about being chosen for a mission. But in any case, those three chapters in Romans are much more about those three chapters are much more about the relationship of Israel and the church than the doctrine of predestination, free will, or any of those related doctrines. Do those come up? Yes, I think they do, and I think it's worthwhile. I wish my Arminian brethren would be more willing to spend some time talking about and preaching from those chapters, but they aren't exactly favorites. Nonetheless, I think they do give us a pattern for how we can see these texts, Old and New Testament texts, combining. And we get down to what is probably the most controversial statement that Dr. Weiss makes right at the end of the chapter, where he says, he talks about learning to get along and extending the getting along to those in Islam, which also claim the same roots, which a lot of people are going to say, well, no, that's not really true. I get the frequent question, I'm asked frequently, do Muslims worship the same God as Christians and Jews? And it's one of those, it's one of those questions. We have a predetermined pair of answers. If you want to be friendly to Islam and to Muslims, you'll say yes. If you are either more about converting Muslims to Christianity or anti-Muslim, you're supposed to say no. Unfortunately, I have to say yes and no. And here's the simple problem. As monotheists, we believe that there is only one God. Now, we can talk about idolatry, worshiping false gods, but we only actually believe in one. And so that real question has to come up. What is our concept? How do we understand God? And how does that impact who we say someone is worshiping? This gets, I think, very, very dangerously into the territory of judgment. I was reading a blog just a couple of days ago by somebody who commented about another group of people. Well, I don't know them personally, but if I could go and spend some time with them, I would be able to make a determination as to whether they're saved. That is getting way over into the area of judgment. Matthew 7 is very interesting on this, and it hits many of us from both directions. 7:1, judge not that you be not judged, but at the same time, a little further down the line, it says, by their fruits you shall know them. We are allowed to look at actions. We are allowed to look at activities and say, this is right, this is wrong. But as far as knowing who is saved, between those passages of Matthew 25, when the people who think they're on the good list with Jesus aren't, and the people who are on the good list say, when did we do any of these good things? I would suggest that the Bible is saying we don't get to make that particular kind of judgment. So the question that the question of who does somebody worship, is it the same God, is not a question that I would try to answer. The question that I would try to answer is their concept of God the same, and is their concept of God one that I can get on board with? And that is something that we can make public, we can make explicit, and we can discuss. There are differences in concept of God between two Christians, between different Christian denominations. There's a difference in the concept of God between myself and a Calvinist, and I'm perfectly happy to call Calvinists Christians, and hopefully that they'll allow that I am a Christian as well. There's differences in our concepts. There's differences in concept of God in Christianity, where we have, for example, such things as the doctrine of the Trinity, and in Judaism. Are we worshiping the same God? Determining what somebody else is worshiping is not my problem. Saying what I see as the concept of God, and that is to go back to my last week's discussion of testimony. What I do is I say, here is the God that I know, here is the God that I experience, and here is my experience with God. And let other people do the determination. We tend to think that we're going to handle the results. We tend to think that we're going to make certain things happen. But what we're really called upon to do is to be witnesses. We are called upon to give our testimony. And for that, all we have to ask is the question, not are they worshiping the same God? Are they evil people or not? It's really not the thing. It's to say, is the concept of God the same? And more importantly, simply to say, Here is how I experience God. Here is my testimony of God's actions. It is much more important to be able to give our testimony than to be able to show how wrong somebody else is. As a matter of fact, I find very little value in showing how wrong somebody else is. Showing somebody else a better place that they can be is a much more useful spiritual thing to do. Want to remind you again that on next Tuesday night, we'll be talking about violence in the Old Testament and how to read some of the violent passages and interpret and maybe even preach them. That'll be with Dr. Alden Thompson, who's the author of books such as Who's Afraid of the Old Testament God and the book Inspiration, Hard Questions, Honest Answers, which Energeon will be reissuing in a second edition later this year. Alden will be joined by Dr. Alan Bevere, who is a Methodist pastor and adjunct seminary professor and author of the books The Character of Our Discontent, which came up from his conviction that Christian preachers should spend more time preaching about the Old Testament, and The Politics of Witness. So we're going to have some interesting questions to ask them. Next week, I'm going to be talking about the chosen 12, the 12 apostles, from chapter 16 of Dr. Weiss's book, Meditations on According to John. Again, thanks for the slight, I apologize for the slight delay and for the difficulty there that I had with my e-reader, which I'm sure I'll have fixed next time. Thanks for joining me and have a great evening.